Hi, everyone. Today we are discussing Chapter 6, Emotional Intelligence, Becoming a Resonant Leader. Today's chapter is about how someone actually becomes a resonant leader. Up to this point, we've talked about what emotional intelligence is and why it matters. Now the question becomes, how do people actually develop it? This chapter argues that strong leadership is not just something people are born with. It can be developed intentionally through reflection, feedback, practice, and supportive relationships. The resonant leader. This introduces the chapter's main focus. Emotional intelligence is essential for effective leadership because it helps leaders inspire, motivate, and connect with other people. A resonant leader is not just smart or technically skilled. A resonant leader understands how to manage themselves and relationships in a way that creates trust and positive energy. In real life, this is the manager people want to work for, not just the one with the title. Think about the difference between a boss who only gives instructions and a boss who can sense when the team is overwhelmed and adjusts the tone. The second one is usually the person employees remember as a real leader. The five discoveries, a path to growth. We will delve into a self-directed learning model known as the five discoveries. This framework guides individuals in intentionally developing their leadership capabilities and desired self. It's a self-directed learning model, which means meaningful leadership growth does not usually come from someone forcing change on you. It comes from intentionally understanding who you want to be, who you are now, what needs to change, and then practicing new habits over time. This chapter treats leadership growth like a journey, not a quick fix. Let's look at Bill's story. Many high-level leaders suffer from a lack of honest feedback, leading to poor self-awareness. Bill's experience illustrates how this deficit can impede leadership effectiveness and political acumen. This is really about what happens when a leader lacks honest feedback. Bill saw himself as important and influential, but other people saw him very differently. He spread rumors, overanalyzed everything, and created tension, yet no one had taken him aside and clearly explained how this behavior was affecting others. The chapter uses this example to show that poor self-awareness can seriously limit leadership effectiveness. This happens all the time at work. A supervisor may think they are being assertive and involved, while employees experience them as nosy, dramatic, or exhausting. Without real feedback, they often never realize the gap. Understanding the CEO disease. This slide explains CEO disease, which is the information vacuum that develops around leaders when people stop telling them the whole truth. Sometimes employees hold back because they are afraid of the leader's reactions. Other times they want to look positive, be loyal, or avoid awkward conversations. The result is that leaders get filtered information and start making decisions without a full picture of reality. For example, a business owner may think everything is running smoothly because employees keep saying, "No problem, we've got it," when in reality the team is burned out and systems are falling apart. What are the consequences of withheld feedback? This looks at the damage that happens when people withhold honest feedback. Leaders can become more out of touch, more overconfident, and less effective over time. The chapter makes the point that the higher someone moves in an organization, the harder it often becomes for them to receive candid information. That means the people with the most power may have the least accurate self-understanding unless they intentionally seek feedback. Leaders receive incomplete information about organizational realities. Poor performance feedback leads to inaccurate self-assessment. The problem is often compounded for women and minority leaders. There's a fear of hurting feelings that prevents honest, constructive communication. The illusion of superiority. This slide gets at a really important point. Many leaders believe they know themselves well, but the data shows otherwise. People in higher positions often rate themselves much more generously than others will rate them. That means self-confidence is not the same thing as self-awareness. True self-awareness requires checking your self-perception against how others actually experience you. For example, a professor may think they are approachable because they say students can email anytime, but if their tone feels harsh or dismissive, students may not experience them as approachable at all. Self-awareness and company performance, harder study. This slide appears to connect self-awareness to research showing that high-performing leaders tend to have a more accurate understanding of themselves. The larger idea from the chapter is that honest information about your leadership capabilities is crucial for growth. If you cannot accurately see your strengths and weaknesses, it becomes very hard to improve intentionally. So, the best performing CEOs exhibit high self awareness with their self assessments aligning closely with subordinate ratings on key leadership abilities. The worst performing CEOs showed low self awareness, rating themselves highest on abilities where subordinates rated them the lowest. Let's look at the executive's perception gap. This has the same theme by focusing on the gap between how executives see themselves and how others see them. The chapter notes that leaders at the highest levels often have the least accurate view of their own behavior. That makes this a leadership problem, not just a personal one, because blind spots at the top affect the whole organization. High level executives tend to rate themselves more generously on EI competencies. The higher a leader's position, the greater the inflation rate in self assessment. This misperception results in a less accurate view of their impact on others. For example, if a senior leader thinks they are inspiring, but employees find their speeches flat and disconnected, the leader may keep repeating the same ineffective approach because nobody tells them the truth. Resistance to change, a core barrier. Leaders often resist accurate feedback because they fundamentally believe they cannot alter long ingrained habits. This belief can deter both their own growth and the candid feedback from subordinates. So, a major obstacle is that many leaders do not ask for real feedback because deep down they don't believe they can truly change. The chapter suggests that if a leader assumes their habits are fixed, then even accurate feedback feels pointless or threatening. That mindset blocks development before it even begins. Nurture over nature, leaders are made. Contrary to common belief, emotional intelligence can be learned and significantly improved. Even deeply ingrained habits can be transformed, enabling leaders to adopt new, more effective styles. This is one of the chapter's most hopeful ideas. Great leaders are not simply born that way. The research argues that emotional intelligence competencies can be learned and improved over time. So, leadership development is much more about practice, motivation, and intentional growth than about natural talent alone. For example, someone may start out as a great individual contributor but a poor manager. With feedback and practice, that same person can become much better at coaching, listening, and leading. Let's look at the case of Nick Memken, from pacesetter to visionary coach, a sales leader's journey to resonant leadership. The slide focuses on Nick Memken, who is one of the chapter's central examples. He had been very successful in sales, but when he became the head of an agency, his leadership abilities were not nearly as strong. He had to move beyond just being just a pace setter and start learning how to coach and connect with people more effectively. In his initial role, this is the starting point. He was a star salesperson, which often means someone that is highly driven, competent, and used to succeeding through personal effort. But leadership requires something different. It requires helping other people succeed, not just pushing yourself hard. That is a major transition many professionals struggle with. For example, a top teacher does not automatically become a great department chair. Being excellent individually is not the same as developing others. Early challenges existed. Agency was ranked in the bottom quartile. Mimkin's style was demotivating for salespeople and it increased tension. Mimkin faced challenges early on, including poor agency performance and the challenges of leading people effectively. The chapter uses this to show that success in one role does not guarantee success in another. Leadership often exposes weaknesses in empathy, coaching, patience, and communication that were less visible before. Coaching focus. He began one-on-one coaching, managed impulses, and balanced criticism with positive reinforcement. This is the turning point where Mimkin began coaching his people more intentionally. Rather than just focusing on what subordinates were doing wrong, he began learning how to understand their needs and help them improve. That shift is a big part of what turned him into a more resonant leader. An example of this is there's a big difference between a manager who says, "Why isn't this done?" and one who says, "What is getting in your way and how can I help you improve?" So let's look at 18 months later. He shifted to a coaching and visionary leadership style, dramatically increasing the team motivation and clarity. So there was a measurable improvement after sustained effort. The chapter emphasizes that real leadership growth takes time. It's not about a single workshop or motivational speech. It comes from repeatedly practicing new behaviors until they become more natural and effective. Long term, 3 to 5 years later, the agency won national awards for growth. moving from the bottom to the top quartile in productivity. That matters because the chapter is pushing back against the idea that change fades quickly. When development is done the right way, improvement can continue over years and become part of how a leader consistently operates. The slides revisits Mimkin's overall journey. The takeaway is that emotional intelligence development can create changes that affect not only workplace performance, but also relationships more broadly. The chapter even notes that some of these improvements carried over into family life, which reinforces how deeply leadership habits are tied to overall emotional functioning. Sustainable emotional intelligence gains beyond the honeymoon. Mimkin's success demonstrates that emotional intelligence learning can be sustained long term. Effective leadership development is not a fleeting honeymoon effect, but a lasting transformation. Many training programs produce short-term enthusiasm, but that improvement fades once people return to everyday pressures. The chapter argues that emotional intelligence development can go beyond that short burst if it is approached correctly. For example, people often leave a professional development day excited, but a week later they are back to their normal habits. The chapter is asking, what will make change actually stick? The shortcomings of traditional training. This slide builds on that problem. Traditional training often fails because it does not change deep emotional habits. People may learn concepts intellectually, but when stress returns, they fall back into old patterns. The chapter says lasting leadership growth requires more than information. It requires intentional effort, emotional commitment, and real practice. Immediate enthusiasm for training often fades within 3 to 6 months. Old knee-jerk responses resurface amidst daily demands and pressures. Billions are spent on training with often meager and unsustainable results. The half-life of knowledge learned in an MBA course can be as short as 6 weeks. So what's the key to lasting learning? This slide is really important because it says motivation drives lasting growth. If change is focused on someone, it usually disappears once the pressure is gone. But if a leader genuinely wants to become better and that goal connects to who they want to be, then the learning is much more likely to last. A person who works on patients only because HR told them to may not change much. A person who wants to become the kind of leader others trust is much more likely to keep practicing. Genuine intrinsic motivation is paramount for effective learning. When learning is forced or generic, participants merely go through the motions and retention is minimal. How the brain matters. This slide shifts into the neuroscience behind change. The chapter explains that emotional intelligence depends on circuitry between the prefrontal cortex, which handles executive thinking, and the limbic system, which governs feelings, impulses, and drives. So improving leadership is not just learning new ideas, it is strengthening new emotional and behavioral patterns in the brain. So the neocortex is the thinking brain. It governs analytical and technical abilities, rapidly grasps concepts, and is efficient for how-to learning, like using software or making a sales call. The limbic system, or the emotional brain, manages feelings, impulses, and drives. It's a slower learner, especially for ingrained habits, requiring sustained motivation, extensive practice, and feedback. Re-educating the emotional brain. Improving leadership skills, which are deeply rooted in emotional habits, necessitates a learning model distinct from cognitive approaches. It demands consistent practice and repetition to foster new neural pathways. This slide explains that leadership habits often live in the emotional brain, not just in conscious thought. That means change requires repetition and emotional engagement, not just understanding concepts once. In other words, you cannot simply think your way into becoming a more resonant leader. You have to practice new reactions until they become more automatic. For example, a leader may know they should stay calm during conflicts, but unless they practice that repeatedly, their old habit of snapping or shutting down may keep taking over. Neuroplasticity. Change is always possible. The human brain can form new neural connections and pathways throughout adulthood. Neural connections used regularly become stronger, unused ones weaken. Active learning is crucial for stimulating new connections and altering emotional brain centers. To revise a limbic neural pattern, a new limbic connection is required. This slide emphasizes one of the most encouraging ideas in the chapter. Change is possible. The brain can continue to develop. Emotional intelligence competencies can be built throughout life, so leaders are not stuck with the habits they developed early in their careers. The self-directed learning model, 5 discoveries. This framework is for intentional personal change. It introduces Boyetti's framework for an intentional personal change. The five discoveries are the core process for becoming a more resonant leader. They include understanding your ideal self, your real self, your learning agenda, experimentation and practice, and the role of trusting relationships. This is the heart of the chapter. Let's look at the ideal self. This is clarifying who you aspire to be, a vision that fuels passion and hope. That means asking, who do I want to be as a leader and as a person? What values matter most to me? What kind of impact do I want to have? The chapter suggests that real change starts with a positive vision that creates hope and energy, not just with a list of flaws. For example, a professor might say, I want to be the kind of leader who pushes students while still making them feel respected and capable. That vision gives direction to future growth. Let's look at the real self. This is assessing who you are now, identifying strengths and critical gaps between ideal and real. This is where honest feedback matters. The goal is not to tear yourself down. It is to accurately understand what you already do well and what needs development if you want to move closer to your ideal self. Learning agenda. This is developing a detailed plan to build on strengths and reduce gaps, aligned with personal learning preferences. A learning agenda is different from a performance improvement plan that only highlights deficiencies. It is a growth-oriented roadmap built around developing strengths, addressing key gaps, and moving toward your ideal self. The tone matters here. It should feel purposeful and hopeful, not punishing. Instead of saying, I need to stop being bad at conflict, a leader might say, I want to get better at difficult conversations by preparing better questions, listening more, and responding more calmly. 4, experimentation and practice. This is actively practicing new behaviors, thoughts, and feelings until they reach mastery. This slide gets at the action stage. Leaders have to practice new behaviors in real situations. The chapter treats this like trying out new ways of leading, reflecting on what happens, and repeating what works. Development becomes real only when it shows up in meetings, conversations, stressful moments, and everyday decisions. Trusting relationships. Cultivating supportive relationships are essential for candid feedback, affirmation, and encouragement throughout the change process. This encourages the role of supportive relationships. Change is easier and more sustainable when leaders have people around them who can encourage them, challenge them, and tell them the truth. These relationships act like a support system for growth. For example, a mentor, colleague, coach, or honest friend can make a huge difference by saying, you handled that conversation much better, or you slipped back into that old pattern there. This slide summarizes the 5 discoveries together. The key point is that transformation is not one event. It moves through these stages: vision, honest assessment, planning, practice, and support. When leaders follow that sequence intentionally, growth becomes much more likely to last. The first discovery is my ideal self. Who do I want to be? The second discovery was my real self. Who am I? What are my strengths and gaps? The third discovery is my learning agenda. How can I build on my strengths while reducing my gaps? The fourth discovery is experimenting with and practicing new behaviors, thoughts, and feelings to the point of mastery. And the fifth discovery, developing supportive and trusting relationships that make change possible. Sustainable emotional intelligence gains, the Weatherhead study. This slide introduces evidence that emotional intelligence training can produce long-term gains. The chapter compares stronger development programs with more typical approaches and shows that people can improve on emotional intelligence competencies over time, especially when the learning process is designed well. 47% see improvement in self-awareness and self-management competencies. This is up to 2 years post-graduation. There's 75% improvement in social awareness and relationship management competencies up to 2 years post-graduation. There's 63% sustained improvement in self-awareness and self-management. This is 5 to 7 years post-graduation for part-timers. And 45% sustained improvement in social awareness and relationship management, 5 to 7 years post-graduation for part-timers. So this is the long-term impact of competence-building courses for MBA students. Emotional intelligence development, Weatherhead versus typical MBA programs, comparing the long-term gains in emotional intelligence. This compares stronger developmental programs with typical MBA-style programs. The chapter suggests that ordinary programs may produce small improvements, but intentional competence building programs can produce much stronger and longer lasting ones. 2 to 4% typical MBA programs show minimal gains in EI skills. Some typical MBA programs even show a decrease in social awareness and relationship management. 75% Weatherhead's approach leads to significantly higher improvements, up to 75% in relationship management. This slide appears to continue the comparison visually. The lesson for students is that development design matters. Not all leadership training is equal. Programs that go deeper into reflection, practice, and intentional change tend to create better outcomes. It continues the same chart sequence. A practical takeaway here is that learning emotional intelligence is less like memorizing a formula and more like building a long-term capability. That is why deep developmental programs outperform surface level training. The important message is that intentionally emotional engaged leadership development creates much more meaningful growth than programs that stay only at the level of classroom knowledge. Continuous development of emotional intelligence competencies. The Weatherhead study revealed that students continued to develop new strengths on their own years after the course, providing good evidence that emotional intelligence competencies can be acquired and enhanced throughout one's life. It emphasizes the emotional intelligence growth that can continue after formal training ends. The chapter even notes that people sometimes improved later on competencies they had not initially targeted. That suggests that once leaders learn how to grow, they can keep developing in their own way over time. The journey of self-transformation. Becoming a Resonant leader is a continuous and intentional journey of self-discovery, practice, and building supportive relationships. With motivation and concerted effort, deep and lasting personal growth is achievable. This brings the chapter together by framing development as an ongoing journey. Becoming a Resonant leader is not about perfection. It is about learning how to be more intentional, more self-aware, and more effective over time. The chapter's tone here is realistic but optimistic. Real change is hard, but it is absolutely possible. The biggest barrier to growth is often not lack of ability, but lack of awareness and intentional practice. Leadership development starts when someone is honest enough to ask, who am I now and who do I want to become? The main takeaway from chapter 6 is that resonant leadership can be developed through the 5 discoveries, honest feedback, real motivation, deliberate practice, and supportive relationships. Leaders can change in ways that last. So leadership is not fixed. It is something people can keep revisiting and improving throughout their lives and careers.